Good evening, and welcome everyone here this evening for what I suspect will be a fascinating program in our fall public program series. My name is Mike Hemphill. I'm Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here at the Clinton School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here and also to remind us all at this point, if we would please turn off our cell phones or any other electronic devices that you might have that would have a tendency to interfere with our sound system. I'm sure everybody in the audience would appreciate that. I can hear them all going off. That's terrific. It was almost 2 years ago that we had David Eisenhower here at the Clinton School talking about presidential libraries. And he did two things that night that I remember that were really interesting. One is he drew a fascinating parallel between the presidencies of President Eisenhower and President Clinton. And the second thing he did is he made a fairly compelling argument about presidential libraries as archives, not necessarily of the individual president, but as archives of the historical era. And I thought about that this afternoon as we were preparing for our presentation this evening, as we sit here in this building just to the, what would it be, the southeast of that wonderful library behind us, that every day all of us at this school have the opportunity to walk through the front doors of this wonderful building. That because of the efforts of those that are committed to historic preservation, we get to not only do important work here, but we get to work in this wonderful space. And that this building serves in that way as a very important historical marker for all of us. The individual this evening who will be introducing our speaker is somebody who's been involved in the field of historic preservation for most of her career, beginning with working for her county historical society in her native Indiana. Sherry Nichols, since moving to Little Rock in 1978, has twice served as the executive director of the Quapaw Quarter Association, and she's done extensive research and writing on Little Rock's historical districts. She has served on numerous commissions and committees, including the Little Rock Historic District Commission and the Little Rock Visitor Foundation, and she is currently serving a 9-year term as one of Arkansas's 2 representatives on the Board of Advisors of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I can think of no one more qualified to introduce our speaker this evening. Would you please welcome Sherry Nichols.
Thank you. It is a pleasure for me to be able to introduce this evening's speaker. We in the preservation community, we're so excited that he was coming to Little Rock again, and I think he's had a good day. When Richard Moe became the 7th president of the National Trust in 1993, he brought to the position a lifelong interest in history and a career-long commitment to public service. He's a native of Duluth, Minnesota, so when he begins speaking, you're going to know that he's not from these parts. He graduated from Williams College in Massachusetts and from the University of Minnesota School of Law, and he held administrative positions at the city, state, and federal levels, and practiced law in Washington, D.C. before becoming president of the National Trust. His long and exemplary service to the Trust has been recognized in many ways. He serves on the board of the Ford Foundation, and he's been awarded honorary doctorates by the University of Maryland and the University of Minnesota. In 2003, he was named an honorary member of the American Institute of Architects. Just last year, he received the National Building Museum's prestigious Vincent Scully Prize in recognition of his leadership in moving historic preservation into the mainstream of American life. Also last year, he received the American Historical Association's Theodore Roosevelt Woodrow Wilson Award for Public Service. Last but not least, he is an author. His Civil War history, The Last Full Measure of the Life and Death of the 1st Minnesota Volunteers, was published in 1993, and he co-authored Changing Places, Rebuilding Community in the Age of Sprawl, which was published in 1997. He will be touching on the topic of sprawl in his remarks tonight, but his talk this evening goes far beyond that one issue to discuss the much larger challenge of climate change and how this very serious problem can and must be addressed through historic preservation efforts. It's my pleasure to give to you Richard Moe, President of the National Trust for Historic Preservation.
Thank you so much, Sherry. It's a great honor to be here, and especially to be introduced by somebody that I not only have great affection for, but who I so admire for her work in preservation both here and nationally. She has a national impact way beyond Little Rock, believe me. It is a great honor to be here at the Clinton School for Public Service. I love that name, the School for Public Service. It's the only one of its kind in the country. And I was telling some of the students earlier, the concept of public service didn't exist when I was that age until John F. Kennedy said, "Ask not." Remember that? And so it really inspired a whole generation of us. But I always believed it meant government service. It means a whole lot more. And I'm so taken with the quality and the breadth and the depth of these students that I just met with. Skip Rutherford, thank you for being here. Skip has to run along, but he's an old friend, and I'm just very honored that you should be here even briefly, and I'm so impressed by what you've done to put this whole thing together. It just, it's brilliant. Mike Hemphill, thank you for your remarks and your welcoming and your service as dean here. Patrick Kennedy, Nikolai Tapapa, and Terry Garner, who just gave me a wonderful tour. Boy, well, it just knocked my socks off, that tour. That was really, really something. You've all seen that many times. I'm really delighted to be back in Little Rock. I've been here a number of times, and I did so enjoy seeing that museum. What a great building it is, and what a great asset it is, not only for the city, but for this nation. And, not incidentally, as the dean mentioned, it's a great pleasure to be here in this old depot, restored, beautifully functional. Skip told me that this had served as a nightclub, after it was a depot, a restaurant. I think there were a couple of things it served as that he couldn't tell me about. But it was a multiple-use building, and what the school has done with it is what we call adaptive reuse, and it's a beautiful example of adaptive reuse. I'm going to come back to this building in a little while, but I just must say I'm not at all surprised that this is the home of the Clinton School for Public Service, because both President Clinton and Hillary Rodham Clinton were great friends of preservation when they were in the White House, and still are. And I had the pleasure of working with them both, especially with Hillary, when she formed with me the Save America's Treasures program, which is the largest grant program for historic preservation in the history of the country, and it's still in existence. I can talk more about that later on if you want, but it's a great tribute to Hillary that not enough people know about. And I'll never forget when President Clinton came to what we call the President Lincoln's Cottage now. This is where President Lincoln spent a quarter of his presidency, drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. It's right there in Washington. President Clinton came for a lot of reasons, but one of them was that he heard there was a 9-hole golf course there. And he came out and declared it a national monument on a very hot day in July. And he cared a lot about that place as he cares about history. This building really illustrates how older structures can have several lives, because it has been so many different things. And that's a real cause for celebration, because it's a significant piece of this community's history has been saved, but also because the reuse of this building is an important part of the effort to meet the challenge of climate change. And I'm going to have a lot more to say about that shortly. But first, some of you may not be familiar with the work of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Let me just briefly say what we do and who we are. The National Trust was created in 1949 as the leader of America's preservation movement. We're a privately funded nonprofit organization with about 270,000 members and a staff of about 300 at our headquarters in Washington and offices around the country, 6 regional offices, collection of 29 historic sites. We're an advocacy organization. We're kind of an all-purpose preservation organization. And over the years, we've worked very closely with preservation organizations and government agencies to help ensure the preservation of Arkansas's rich heritage. And as you know, it's very rich. Right now, we're especially excited about an initiative that's underway in the 15-county Arkansas Delta region. This is an effort to implement sustainable development, preservation-based economic development, that focuses on branding and marketing the region's music heritage and its scenic and historic resources. It's a 3-year project, and it's already achieving some dramatic results, now in its 3rd year. The 2 people who are spearheading this effort are here, and I'd like to recognize them. Daniel Carey, the director of our Southwest office, and Beth Wiedauer, the director of the Arkansas Delta Rural Heritage Development Initiative. I'd like to acknowledge them. Thank you. And I'm especially pleased that 6 of the students that I just met with next door are working with Beth and with Daniel in this project to help come up with innovative strategies to promote economic development and sustainable heritage tourism to help the economy of that challenged region. The National Trust's overall mission can be summed up in a single sentence. It's to encourage people to appreciate the importance of the historic buildings, neighborhoods, and landscapes that tell America's stories, and to give them the tools that they need to keep our heritage intact and playing a meaningful role in our daily lives. To put it even more succinctly, the National Trust helps people protect, enhance, and enjoy the places that matter to them. And this leads me to the subject of my remarks this evening. For the next few minutes, I want to talk to you about how preservation can and should, in my view, play an essential role in fighting what may be the greatest crisis of our time, and that is climate change. I'll begin with a reminder of what preservation is all about. When you strip away the rhetoric, preservation is simply having the good sense to hold on to things that are well designed, that link us with our past, and that have plenty of good use left in them, like this building. Preservation in America has embraced that philosophy for more than 150 years now, ever since a woman by the name of Anne Pamela Cunningham rallied the nation to save Mount Vernon. Our work has always been firmly rooted in a respect for history, but today, more than ever before, it is as much concerned with building the future as well as holding on to the past. This concern with the future has never been clearer or more important than it is now. As growing numbers of people are worried about climate change, the degradation of the environment, and our relentless consumption of energy and irreplaceable natural resources, it is increasingly apparent that preservation has an essential role to play in any effort to deal with the environmental crisis that clearly looms over us. Because it necessarily involves the conservation of energy and natural resources, historic preservation has always been the greenest of the building arts. And now it's time to make sure that everybody knows it. Up to now, our approach to life on this planet has been based on the assumption that, well, there's plenty more of that wherever that came from. Well, with our environment in crisis, we have to face the fact that there may not be plenty more of anything except trouble. Today, we're challenged to find a way of living that will ensure the longevity and health of our environmental, economic, and social resources. The seriousness of the problem was laid out in a recent report issued some months ago by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The report states bluntly that warming of the climate system is unequivocal and is the result of human activity. The United States, I regret to say, is a big part of the problem. We have only 5% of the world's population, but we're responsible for 22% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, which of course are the leading cause of climate change. Discussions on this topic usually focus on the need to reduce auto emissions. It's true that transportation, including cars, trucks, trains, airplanes, account for 32% of America's carbon emissions. However, The Pew Center on Climate Change has found that 43% of America's carbon dioxide emissions come from the operation of buildings. And this doesn't include the carbon that is generated by extracting, manufacturing, and transporting building materials. If nearly half of the carbon we send into the atmosphere comes from our buildings, it's clear that any solution to climate change must include being wiser about how we design and use our built environment. The concept of historic preservation as the ultimate recycling is something that people in the preservation community have believed and talked about for many years. Back in 1980, long before the word sustainability came into widespread use, the National Trust issued a Preservation Week poster that featured an old building in the shape of a gasoline can, a reminder that reusing an existing building instead of demolishing it and replacing it with a new one is a good way to conserve energy. Now, much has changed since that poster appeared 28 years ago. The stakes have gotten much higher. Climate forecasts, population growth projections, rising energy costs, dwindling reserves of water and fossil fuels, even the daily news headlines. They all warn us that we can't wait any longer for somebody to figure out what to do. The somebody we need is us, and the need is clearly urgent. The key phrase is sustainable stewardship. The retention and reuse of older buildings is an effective tool for the responsible, sustainable stewardship of our environmental resources, including those that have already been expended. I'm talking about what's called embodied energy. Excuse me. Now, what is embodied energy? Well, here's the concept in a nutshell. Buildings are vast repositories of energy. It takes energy to manufacture or extract building materials, more energy to transport them to the building site, and still more energy to assemble them into an actual building. All of that energy is embodied in the finished structure. And if the structure is demolished and landfilled, the energy locked up in it is totally wasted. What's more, the process of demolition itself uses more energy, and of course the construction of a building in its place uses more yet. Now, we don't have to look very far to find an example that will translate that concept into reality. This building right here. I'm told that this building, now called Sturgis Hall, has about 15,000 square feet of space. According to a formula produced by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, about 24 billion BTUs of energy are embodied in a structure of this size and construction type. For those of you like me who don't know a lot about BTUs, that's the equivalent of 192,000 gallons of gasoline. If this building had been torn down, all of that embodied energy would have been lost. What's more, demolishing this 15,000 square foot building would have created nearly 1,200 tons of waste. That's enough to fill 8 railroad boxcars, a lot of debris going to a landfill that's probably already filled. Once an old building is gone, putting up a new one in its place takes more energy, of course, and it also uses more natural resources and releases more pollutants and greenhouse gases into our environment. It's estimated that constructing a new 15,000 square foot building in place of one that would have been demolished would have released about the same amount of carbon into the atmosphere as driving a car 840,000 miles. Now, the statistics tell us that the way we use our building causes big problems, but incredibly, we propose to solve the problem by constructing more and more new buildings while ignoring the ones that we already have. We can't go on doing that. It all comes down to this simple fact. We cannot build our way out of the global warming crisis. We have to conserve our way out. Everyone associated with the Clinton Presidential Library should be enormously proud of the fact that their building is the first LEED Platinum certified building in Arkansas. It's a wonderful building in many regards, but especially including that one. Similarly, the Heifer International down the street, which I also saw today, deserves our applause for having created a headquarters campus that is environmentally friendly in an exemplary way. These buildings and others like them across the country represent the kind of sustainable design that we should demand in all of our construction projects. But please remember this, no matter how much green technology is employed in its design and construction, any new building represents a new impact on the environment. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have new buildings. Of course we have to have new buildings, but that's a factor that we should remember. The bottom line is that the greenest building is one that already exists. This means that in addition to building green, we have to make wiser use of what we've already built. Anthropologist Ashley Montagu has said that the secret to staying young is to die young. But the trick is to do it as late as possible. All over the United States, people are showing that old buildings put to new uses can stay young to a ripe old age. They're demonstrating that buildings are renewable and not disposable resources. If that's not sustainability, I don't know what else to call it. It's often alleged that historic buildings are energy hogs. But in fact, some older buildings are as energy efficient as many recently built ones. In fact, when the General Services Administration, GSA, examined its building inventory in 1999, it found that the utility costs for historic buildings were 27% less than for more modern buildings. Now, it's not hard to figure out why. Many historic buildings have thick, solid walls, like this one, resulting in greater thermal mass and reducing the amount of energy needed for heating and cooling. Buildings designed before the widespread use of electricity feature transoms, high ceilings, and large windows for natural light and ventilation, as well as shaded porches and other features to reduce solar gain. Architects and builders paid close attention to siting and landscaping as tools for maximizing sun exposure during the winter months and minimizing it during the summer months. Unlike their more recent counterparts that celebrate the concept of planned obsolescence, most historic and many other older buildings were built to last. Their durability gives them an unlimited renewability, a fact that underscores the folly of wasting them. A report from the Brookings Institution indicates that by 2030, we will have demolished and replaced nearly 1/3 of all existing buildings in this country. Now, how much energy will it take to demolish and replace all those buildings? Enough energy to power the entire state of California for a decade. Old and existing buildings aren't the problem. In fact, they can be and must be a part of the solution. They're not the whole solution, but they're an important part of the solution. Of course, some older buildings need retrofits to improve their energy efficiency, but the notion that old buildings, by their very nature, are inherent energy wasters is largely a product of consumer mentality. It's not true. Manufacturers make things they want us to buy, including the so-called energy efficiency boosters that we don't always need. The bottom line is we don't have to buy our way into sustainability. I believe that climate change is a defining issue of our time and will be for a long time to come. The debate is over, the facts are in, and it's time to act. One of the first and most important things that must happen is a thoroughgoing revision of current government policies that foster unsustainable development. For decades, national, state, and local policies have facilitated, indeed even encouraged, the development of new suburbs while leaving existing communities behind. This pattern of development is fiscally irresponsible, environmentally disastrous, and ultimately unsustainable. To replace it, we need federal policy that directs growth to existing communities. You'll notice I said federal policy. Now, as you know, land use policy has traditionally been a function of state and local government, but it is an indisputable fact that where the federal government chooses to spend its money, our money, particularly our highway money, has a huge impact on local planning and development. We need federal policy that stops rewarding unsustainable development and enhances the viability and livability of the communities that we already have. It makes absolutely no sense for us to recycle newsprint and bottles and aluminum cans while we're throwing away entire buildings, even neighborhoods. We also need incentives to encourage reuse of older buildings. In the past 10 years alone, historic tax credit incentives have sparked the rehab of more than 217 million square feet of commercial and residential space and saved huge amounts of energy in the process. We must ensure the continued availability of these tax credits and expand their use in older buildings that are not necessarily historic, but still reusable. Equally important, we must provide similar incentives to help private homeowners use green technology in maintaining and renovating their homes. Finally, the federal government must get serious about the urgent need to retrofit our existing building stock. I've said it before, but it's worth repeating. New green construction alone is not the answer. Even if we require that every new building must be green, and I wish that we could, this doesn't address the massive amount of carbon emitted by the operation of existing buildings, and we have to fix that. Unfortunately, there are numerous barriers to retrofitting, most of them cost-related. To encourage green retrofits of commercial buildings, the Clinton Climate Initiative, with whom we're talking and working, launched a program last year that provides technical expertise to building owners, makes materials and systems available at wholesale cost, and even offers favorable financing. It's a very innovative program. This is exactly the kind of innovative outreach we need for the nonprofit and private sectors. But private sector action is not enough. We also need the federal government to commit resources to retrofit the more than 300 billion square feet of space in this country's existing buildings. These federal actions should be complemented by steps at the state and local levels, of course. 29 states have enacted their own state credits to promote the reuse of historic buildings. Arkansas, I regret to say, is not one of them. And we need to see these tax incentives adopted here and in other states where they don't presently exist. At the local level, we need building codes that allow flexibility and innovation in making existing buildings more energy efficient. More and more states and cities are developing climate change action plans that outline how they intend to fight global warming, usually through efforts such as expanding recycling programs and encouraging the use of mass transit. Now, many of these plans, even those from cities that are regarded as pace setters in environmental policy, make little or no provision for green retrofits. Even fewer establish retention and reuse of existing buildings as a priority. This is a serious misstep, and we need to correct it. Finally, we need to improve green building rating systems to ensure that they recognize the importance of building reuse. Under the current LEED standards, and I'm delighted that the library is a platinum LEED building. Under the LEED standards, for example, for historic preservation, using 75% of an existing building's core and shell is assigned the same value, about 1 point, as merely installing environmentally friendly carpeting. Makes no sense. But I'm very pleased that we've been working closely with the U.S. Green Building Council to improve recognition of the value of reuse, and I think we're making good progress. Now, the needs that I've mentioned are the driving force behind a new and ambitious sustainability initiative at the National Trust. This initiative is built around 4 core principles of sustainable stewardship. The first of these is reuse buildings. A sound older building that is abandoned or underused is a wasted asset. Not every old building deserves to be saved, but those that are sound and reusable do deserve to be saved. Putting existing buildings to good use reduces demolition and construction waste, lessens the demand for energy and other resources for new building materials, and conserves the energy originally expended to create these buildings. 2, reinvest in older and historic neighborhoods. All of us know how sprawl impacts our lives. But while sprawl devours our landscape, neighborhoods in the inner city and the inner ring of suburbs are vastly underused. Revitalization of existing neighborhoods promotes efficient land use patterns and focuses public and private reinvestments in areas where infrastructure is already in place, already paid for. Furthermore, older neighborhoods are typically compact, centrally located, walkable, and mass transit accessible, characteristics that are promoted by advocates of smart growth. 3, retrofit older and historic buildings to achieve energy efficiency. As I said earlier, many older buildings are remarkably energy efficient. Data from the U.S. Energy Information Agency suggests that buildings constructed before 1920 are actually more energy efficient than buildings built at any time afterwards, except for those built after 2000. Nevertheless, many older buildings are badly in need of energy efficiency upgrades, and there are plenty of techniques and products on the market that make these upgrades much less challenging than they once were. And this leads me to the final point. 4, we must respect historic integrity. An increasing number of sensitive and successful rehab projects demonstrates that historic buildings can go green without losing their distinctive character. And this building, again, is a great example of that. There's the distinctive character that makes them significant and appealing. Architects, developers, and property owners no longer have to choose between getting the energy efficiency they want or keeping the character they love. They can have both. As the keystone of this new sustainability initiative, we're establishing the National Trust Preservation Green Lab, probably on the West Coast, perhaps in Seattle, to collaborate with selected cities and states to better integrate historic preservation into sustainable development policy. We'll form partnerships with state and local governments to develop and implement climate action plans that make preservation and conservation of the existing building stock a priority, and to create zoning ordinances, building codes, and other plans that support the reuse and retrofit of existing buildings. The Preservation Green Lab will also forge partnerships with universities, green groups, and others to ensure that the concept of recycling buildings is incorporated into broader academic and environmental agendas. And it will identify and support demonstration projects that show how historic buildings can go green. We're sitting in an exemplary green rehab project right now. I recently saw another one in Portland, Oregon, that turned an armory built in 1892 into a state-of-the-art performing space. Last spring in Washington, the National Trust opened President Lincoln's Cottage to the public. Just a few yards away from the cottage, the Visitors Education Center is housed in a renovated historic building that is fully LEED certified. Projects like these, and there are more and more of them all the time, show that the best historic preservation practices can be integrated with green building practices. We aim to make sure that people know about these. Finally, our sustainability initiative will work to refute some common misconceptions about energy efficiency in older buildings, and will make our website a best practices resource for how to reduce energy consumption and use green technology in the rehab of older structures. You'll hear more about the sustainability initiative in the coming months, but I believe it's one of the most exciting and important efforts the National Trust has ever undertaken. I hope I've impressed you with the seriousness of the challenges we face and the critical importance of dealing with it sensibly, successfully, and immediately. We have a choice. We can do nothing for a while longer until we're forced to take action by soaring energy costs, the disappearance of irreplaceable resources, and the realities of climate change. Or we can take steps now to develop a smart, sustainable development ethic and the policies that will support it. Historic preservation in this country has always sustained America by working to protect and celebrate the evidence of its past. Now, by addressing the challenge of climate change, preservation can and must play a leadership role in the sustainable stewardship of America's future. Thank you very much.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. And over here.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. I know that historic preservation encompasses more than just restoring old buildings. A number of years ago, there was an issue with the Disney company and Manassas Battlefield in Virginia. Could you briefly summarize what happened there, what the final outcome was, and could you comment on any other historic sites that don't have buildings that might, and what is happening to them in regard to climate and sprawl?
Well, that was a really interesting and illustrative example of where preservation kind of found its way in. What you're talking about is the Disney company's plan to build an historic theme park. Right. Feel free to laugh at that, yeah. On some vacant farmland in the middle of one of the most important historical landscapes in America, the northern Piedmont of Virginia, where there's Civil War battlefields, where our founding fathers, so many of them were born. And there were, but on the particular site where they wanted to build this theme park, there were no historic structures, nor had anything particularly significant ever happened there. But what we figured out, and we labored over this, we wrestled with this, and what we finally concluded was that we got some demographers and others to come in and help us, projecting 20 years ahead. If that theme park had been built, it would have created a city going in all four directions, sprawl. In other words, a sprawling city, the equivalent of Tallahassee, Texas, so 120,000 people, something like that, to Tallahassee, Florida. And so it became a defining issue in terms of fighting sprawl. It was a different form of preservation issue. So we went to the mattresses on that. We had a lot of friends and allies, and the historians, David McCullough and Jim McPherson and others, came in. And we did battle for a full year on that, and we thought we were going to have to litigate it, and it would go on for another couple of years. But what happened was that Michael Eisner, running a family-friendly company, didn't like the fact that his company was being trashed by all the historians for building a plastic history theme park. So they decided that they were going to move to another location, but they never did. They just disappeared. So it had a happy outcome, but it was very interesting for us. It was kind of a watershed moment for the preservation movement because it defined preservation in a way that had never been defined before. It was the collateral effects of that development that would have overwhelmed Civil War battlefields, would have overwhelmed African American cemeteries, would have overwhelmed these fragile small towns in all four directions. So I'm very proud of the preservation movement for stepping up to that.
Tisha, you have a question
Because it's an important issue in Little Rock right now, would you comment for a minute on the importance of preservation of park spaces, public park spaces?
Park spaces.
And what role the National Trust might have in supporting local efforts to restore public parks?
Yes, we are not just in the building business. We're not just in the business of saving buildings. We're very proud of the fact that we also try to preserve historic landscapes. And these landscapes can often be parks. But even beyond the historic significance of a park, parks like churches, like schools, like post offices, like other key functions, play a critical role in making a community what a community is. So I believe parks are absolutely essential. I'm not familiar with the exact circumstances here, but if there's a park that's of importance to the families in that neighborhood, then that park ought to be fought for.
Any other questions? Right there. It's coming.
Thank you. You had mentioned two costs, the cost of retrofitting in a historic building and also the cost of retrofitting it with green design elements. How do you preserve the economic diversity of a population that sort of typifies unrestored historic districts and maintain that while retrofitting the buildings with those same Am I making sense?
Are you asking, how do you retrofit in an affordable way? Is that what you're saying? Clearly, an incentive is needed. And what we are working on now, and which we hope to come up with early next year, is a series of incentives at all three levels of government. We're working on it, the historic tax credit is an incentive to restore historic buildings. It has incidentally a sustainability benefit to it. What we are eager to do is to pair those credits or to establish an independent tax credit that will encourage people to restore their older building. It doesn't have to be historic, maybe 30 years old, because if you're just limiting it to historic buildings, you're not going to have the impact on climate change and carbon emissions that we really need to have. So there obviously have to be standards in order to qualify for that kind of credit. We're wrestling with that now. But what we want to do is to make these credits enough of an incentive that they're affordable, not just to business owners, but to homeowners. And this is a big reach. We've never done this in this country before. But as I said in my remarks, I don't know how we can deal with this issue of climate change without dealing with the 43% of carbon dioxide that is emitted from existing buildings. Otherwise, we're not addressing the issue fully.
Well, let's thank, one more.
Follow-up to that, how do you address gentrification? Because that seems to figure in with, I think, what that gentleman's question.
Transportation?
Gentrification.
Oh, gentrification, yes. Gentrification is an old issue in the preservation movement, and it's a real one in many cases. Because while the good news is that almost every city in America is being revitalized in its downtown in some way, and a lot of this is because of loft conversions, people living downtown. There's no one single bullet that will revitalize a downtown. Some people think, well, if we get this arena or we get a theater or something, it's a combination of things. But the single most important thing, I believe, is getting people to live downtown, because then other economic activities will follow. But it's true that sometimes in some of the more attractive neighborhoods, and this is unfortunately one of the consequences, that people of modest means get driven out because the housing prices are more expensive, the taxes go up, and it's no longer affordable. We try in everything we do when revitalizing a neighborhood or encouraging people to revitalize their neighborhood is to keep the people that want to stay in that neighborhood, keep them there. It's absolutely important, because it's a people business. Preservation is not a structure business, it's a people business. And we're all about community. And if you can't keep people in their communities, then what's the use of any of this activity?
Well, let's thank Richard Rowe for that wonderful talk.
Thank you.